It is now my pleasure to introduce a conversation with Noble leaders to name and confront our past and discuss our way forward in this work to dismantle racism at Noble. Our moderator is a former principal of Roe Clark Math and Science Academy, current Chief Schools Officer and Noble alumna, an amazing leader who I'm proud to call my friend, Brenda Cora.
Thank you, CJ. Welcome everyone to Noble's annual kickoff. My name is Brenda Cora, and as CJ said, I'm a Noble grad, a former campus leader, and now Chief Schools Officer. I'm very excited to be with you guys virtually throughout this kickoff, and I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. As CJ stated, as an organization, we're working towards dismantling racism at Noble and striving to becoming anti-racist. In order for us to dismantle racism at Noble, we must name and confront our past. Noble's been around for 21 years. And in that time, while we most definitely began the work of serving and empowering our communities, our intent hasn't always matched our impact. If a racist policy is any that produces inequitable outcomes, then we have plenty of staff members, white, Black, Latinx, Asian, etc., coming to Noble and reinforcing or creating inequity every day. And we have students and families waking up every morning, trusting and believing that our policies give every child an equitable opportunity, even when our data tells us differently. Noble's policies and individual campus practices may be rooted in racist policies and mindsets. And we owe it to Noble community to reflect and reconsider. Today, we have some special guests joining me today in a discussion where we will continue the process of naming and confronting our past in an effort to begin to dismantle racism. As I moderate today's panel, I will name that many of the questions I ask come directly as a result of tensions that many staff members across our organization have surfaced in conversations with me about where we're going in comparison to where we've been. So know that the choice of questions asked today are not gotchas, but rather that they are formed within the spirit of intentionality, because we want to ensure that everyone, all of us, are holding ourselves accountable to the reflection and the action needed to reimagine our work. With that said, please help me in giving a warm virtual welcome to our panelists. Welcome all. Thank you so much for joining me today and volunteering to be a part of the conversation. We have about 20 minutes together, so let's jump in by each of you sharing your name, current role, length of time at Noble, and any previous roles held.
Hi, I'm Matt Nix, and I serve as Noble's president. This is the start of my 9th year at Noble. The first 7 of those years, I was our chief college officer.
Good morning, my name is Kyle Cole. I am the Chief Education Officer, and I'm entering my 13th year serving in that capacity.
Hi, Noble. My name is Rachel Hercule. I teach freshman literature at Mushin and serve as our literacy specialist. I'm also glad to be a part of our network instructional hedgehog team. And this is my 10th year in the network. And I've had a range of experiences supporting the network in my campus, but primarily stayed in the classroom.
Good morning. My name is Jonas Cleves. I'm the principal at Johnson College Prep. This is my 9th year with Noble, formerly the founding Dean of Culture and Assistant Principal at Mushin, also an Assistant Principal in West Philly, and founding Principal of Bluff City High School in Memphis, Tennessee.
Thank you all for being here and welcome. Matt, as our former Chief College Officer and now our interim president, can you share what was your moment of clarity where you recognized Noble needed to operate differently with regard to DEI?
So I think the example I'll give is working with senior rosters. And as part of my work with college counselors, they would send me weekly updates on, if a student had a new test score, if a student was added to a class, if a student transferred out. And, when you think about student retention, Noble's biggest problem has always been with freshmen. But what I found through this process is that seniors were leaving us too. And, it wasn't just any senior, it was more male students, it was more Black students, it was more students at certain campuses. So there are other examples I could give, but I give this one because it was a persistent problem, and it was a problem that I didn't know what to do with. And so even as a senior leader at Noble, I didn't feel empowered to, go off and change things to make the situation better.
Matt, when you noticed the consistent pattern of seniors leaving us, our males leaving us, Black students leaving us, and it being concentrated at certain campuses, did you do anything? Like what did you do as a chief at the organization?
Yeah, so what I did is I started asking questions. Why do seniors leave Noble? Why does it happen more at some campuses than others? Why does it happen for some types of students more than others? And the answers I heard back were related to discipline and promotion. So on the discipline side of things, some campuses were choosing to be stricter in their enforcement of the student code of conduct. And as a consequence, that sometimes led to expulsions. And on the promotion side of things, what would happen is some seniors would learn during the senior year that they were going to have to repeat and do another senior year. And they also knew that in many cases, they could choose to transfer to a neighborhood school and graduate on time. And so obviously, that was something that a lot of students decided to do. And, when I asked these questions of people who had, much more experience running schools than I did, the kind of the tenor of the response was, this is a regrettable result, but it's unchangeable. And it was unchangeable because it was sort of an outcome. It was told to me it was an outcome of a system that was generally working quite well. And, the average kid was benefiting from these systems. And in fact, if we were to change them to make it sort of reduce this problem with seniors leaving us, it would be, on average, would make kids worse off because there's so many kids who are benefiting from this system. And I think it's just one of, many examples we've had over the years of thinking about an average result and judging it good, but not worrying about what happens, particularly for kids who fall on the wrong side of the rule. And so what I didn't say then, but I'm saying now, is that as leaders, we have a special responsibility to think about the kids who fall on the wrong side, right? I think we have a special responsibility, not only to have a good average result, but also to avoid harm.
Thanks, Matt. Kyle, many people have either felt this or have said this throughout the years, and so I'll name that a sentiment that many individuals may hold when it comes to academics at Noble is that we've gone too far in over prioritizing results over the humanity of our babies. Kyle, as our Chief Education Officer for some time now, I'm going to ask for your vulnerability and ask you to share your thoughts on this specific sentiment and how you and your department would respond to this idea today.
Yeah. So I've often heard alumni and current students say that they feel like a number at Noble rather than a human. This was particularly the case during our ACT model days when we were going after 6 points growth and 21 composite. And I'm much to blame for that type of culture. During that time, I and the team I led and am 100% responsible for, put a relentless and often singular focus on assessment design and assessment data. This was my first 8 years at Noble. And this definitely created a culture of numbers. Now, we did see leading industry results when it came down to the ACT. We got a lot of national recognition for it. We got a lot of pats on the back. But when you look at it now and you look back and you look at the programming, the truth is at what cost? Our programming at that time didn't touch all of our students, and we lost students. In fact, I think at that time, probably 1 out of every 3 freshmen that crossed our doors didn't finish with us, didn't graduate with us. And that's on me. That's my failure to focus on the student experience, also build systems around student experience, and to look critically at the classroom and the instructional core and really what was happening for all of our students. Now, of course, today we have some robust systems around the student experience survey, the Noble Classroom, which mobilizes us around a shared language and provides a lot of PD and development to have us focus in on what's really happening in the classroom around the instructional core, questioning the relevancy of our curriculum, the strength of our relationships between students and teachers and curriculum. But that was not the case my first 8 years at Noble, and we lost kids before it, and I'm very sorry for that, and I'm all in on making sure that we never lose track of student experience again. And yeah, so
Thanks, Cal. Can we talk a little bit about the SAT? We know that the SAT evolved from eugenics-based IQ testing in the early 1900s. Tests aimed to push the idea that African Americans were racially, ethnically, and culturally on the low end of the spectrum, and continues in many ways today to be a racist tool that creates barriers and thus far-reaching inequities. Knowing this, is the SAT going to continue to be a North Star for Noble?
Man, I love this question and so glad we're talking about it, because that tension is real and absolutely legit for everything that you've said. The reality is we are using SAT to guide our, more specifically the domains and dimensions, the standards behind the SAT to guide our curriculum work. And the reason for that is because of our strategic planning work last year, when we really engaged a lot of our families and a lot of our students. It was very clear. They're looking at Noble to make college access a reality, college graduation a reality. And while today entrance exams are being relaxed a bit, especially in this time of the pandemic, the reality is it's still a really important tool for a lot of our kids. It will be the difference on competitive financial dollars. It will be the difference on competitive seats. It is a tool that we need to make sure they're ready for. And it's a dirty tool, as our chief equity officer puts it, but still a tool nonetheless that we want to make sure that they're ready with. Now, I say that, but I'm not saying that we should in any way ignore this tension. In fact, I think we should openly be very transparent about this tension in our classrooms with our kids. We should be very clear with them about SAT's racist history and about the current issues that still exist with the SAT. For example, the English domains and dimension standards, like they promote and put value on dominant American English, while at the same time not putting much value on African American vernacular English, which of course is just as valid and just as structured. Now, we need to talk to our kids about, we are teaching you the English domains and dimensions, not because we're interested in you assimilating or changing your identity. We're not teaching these because we believe this is the right and the only way to speak and write. No, we're teaching this because this is what SAT is measuring around writing. And we want you to be able to access this dirty tool of dominant culture. So ultimately, you can access, critique, and change that dominant culture. Long-term, the story of SAT at Noble, whether it's going to be around or not, it's really not for me to say. This needs to be a much more inclusive conversation where we engage our parents, we engage our staff, we engage our students, and we talk about where we need to go. We'll pay attention to the college landscape, but we also need to really have that long and deep conversation with our families and students. And in the meantime, this year, let's make our campuses a place where we're valuing our students as artists, as mathematicians, as scientists, and we're very much looking at the SAT as the floor that it is, and not the ceiling.
Thank you, Cal. Rachel, you're a distinguished teacher at Mushin, which although that means you're deserving of accolades for your success as an educator, I think we sometimes forget that amazing people like you are also human. And so I would like if you could share with us about some of the ways you believe in your journey that your classroom or even campus may have taken part in perpetuating or creating an inequitable culture. And at what point did you realize Noble needed to operate differently?
Yeah. I'll be among the first to tell you distinguished teacher does not mean perfect teacher. And as someone who spent the majority of my time in this network teaching 9th grade, I'm part of this process that some of us call nobilizing. I have to think a lot about how I've used demerits as tools of power and control instead of leaning on relationships and co-creating community with my students. And that's changed over the time that I've been here. I have to think about when have I prioritized my comfort in my classroom instead of centering the needs of my students. And there are two specific moments where I relive how I've chosen to do something about it, or the times where I've actively chosen not to. I think about a moment a few years ago where a group of my Black female students were outside my classroom, like organizing themselves to go to office hours and deciding where to meet up so they take the train home together to be safe, and just like talking to them about their plans. And after they left, a colleague saying, "They're so loud and so disrespectful. Can you believe these freshmen?" And realizing I heard my students very differently. But it made me think, like, how many times have I shared that colleague's sentiment? Or how many times have I heard it and not said anything about it? How many times do we see and hear our students differently because of our own bias, because of our choice to create a relationship before a consequence? And in that moment, I chose to have the conversation with the colleague about it. And I say that not because I want to pat on the back as a white person doing the work, but I say it to call others to keep reflecting on your role and the times where you hear problematic thinking and you actively choose not to do anything, or the times where you don't think about the impact of your own bias on the students that we serve. And I feel like if I don't continue to create spaces to push back on that thinking, or for others to push back on my own problematic thinking, like, this kind of Black girl magic just gets drowned in detentions and I'm responsible. I think about how I can do this better on my own staff and in the adult communities as a teacher leader. A time where I led a hedgehog room and trusted the data, similar to what Matt was talking about, in making choices of who to spotlight. People said in a survey they wanted to hear from a couple of teachers at campuses that had high interim scores. And so I carved out time for those teachers to take the lead, and then quickly realized everyone speaking is a white woman from a North Side campus. And it's not that we didn't have things we could learn, but also I didn't take the time to be critical about whose voices were not represented in the survey data. It was a missed opportunity to spotlight our staff whose voices go unheard because we don't create the opportunities for them to take the lead. I think we have to interrogate, like, whose voices count in the spaces that we have, and how do I use the positions of leadership that I get to stand in because of the time I've spent here, and spend my privilege to get out of the way and amplify voices that are so much more powerful for our students to hear and see themselves. How many times has the notion of white as the default for success created missed opportunities for our kids? And how do I keep pushing against changing that?
Rachel, it sounds like you've started the intentional work, the self-reflection, to start looking at things from an anti-racist lens. And so I'm curious to hear from you. Do you feel empowered to ask your campus leaders the tough questions when practice and policy don't match our desired impact? Or do you have advice on how our colleagues across the organization can begin to have these conversations with their leaders or peers at their campus?
Yeah, that moment in the hallway after I had the conversation with a colleague, I immediately knocked on the door and had a conversation with one of my administrators that, D. Green, thankfully he's leading some work in our network, but it turned into thinking about the policies about how we uphold culture in our shared spaces without demerits. I also have to acknowledge, though, that I've worked with my leaders for a long time. I consider them very close friends. And because of my success in my classroom, my voice gets trusted. But I can't wait for them to have the answers. I am Mushin, I am Noble. It's not something outside of me. My students certainly don't see it as something outside of me. So if I'm not spending the time to interrogate what I'm doing or not doing, if I don't think about the space I take up as a veteran and get out of the way sometimes, I'm still working on it. I don't know if I'll ever be done working on it, but I think the relationships that we build, no matter what our position is at our campus, are really important. And that's how we work together to do this.
Yeah, Rachel, thank you. I appreciate you like doing the work necessary for us to like dismantle racism and strive to becoming anti-racist. Jonas, you started as a dean of culture at Mushin. You left to be a principal outside of Noble, and now you're back as our principal at Johnson College Prep. What did you learn about yourself in Noble while you were in Philly and Memphis?
Yeah, I would definitely say like a dean of culture within Noble, like our job is to enforce those policies on the campus level. And so in doing that, you're taught that, the good of this is to protect the academic environment, and we're doing what's best for kids. And, if they, if they master these concepts around, discipline, that they'll be a better person, after they leave Noble. I think an eye opener for me in leaving Noble in 2016 and going to Philadelphia was, my first day walking into this high school in West Philly. And these were students who, during transition, they were listening to Beyonce over the PA system, and I was shocked. I had never seen anything like that at all. And I remember, leaning over to one of my colleagues, like, what's going on? Is there like a celebration today? And he's just like, no, this is what we do. Like, they transitioned and they were fine. There were no issues. There were, weren't any kids who were like bouncing off of the wall. And just seeing that every single day was an eye opener for me. And also, like, I had to confront the fact that a lot of what we were doing at Noble was grounded in fear. This fear of, kids acting out or not being smart, and our desire to have control, and this very, very arrogant perspective that we know what's best. And, in turn, like if they just follow us, they'll be fine. So it was an extreme eye opener for me, but also like very necessary.
Yeah, Jonas, some people strongly believe that Noble is a racist organization. Do you agree with this statement?
Yeah, so our goal right now is to become an anti-racist organization. I think that sometimes success can blind you. And so the reality is that, if we're denying some of those policies and actions that we sat back, including myself, and did nothing about. Dr. Ibram Kendi describes a racist as one who supports a racist policy through their actions or inaction. We saw the data. We saw how academically and culturally we were not doing what was best for our students of color, specifically our African-American students, and we didn't do anything. So if the question is, are we a racist organization? We have to own that. Yes, we are. And we have to put in the work to pursue anti-racism.
Mm. Why did you decide to come back?
Yeah, some of my closest friends are here in Noble. And so I always stay in touch. And, I heard about some of the great things that were happening and how our paths were aligned. I was growing as a leader with my time in Philadelphia and my time in Memphis. And so the opportunity to come back and serve a community that I know well. My family is from Woodlawn. My family is also from Inglewood. That is a community that, we have had some great moments, but we've also experienced some pain for sure. And so the opportunity to come back to serve that community, and emphasis on serve, like I'm not a governor of the school. I'm not the president of Inglewood. Like, I'm there to serve that community. It was one that I couldn't sidestep at all. And it was an opportunity to come back and do the right thing by the kids who deserve our best.
Mm. Well, we're definitely grateful that you decided to come back, and we're happy to have you at Johnson. Matt and Jonas, I'd like to hear from you guys in the context of DEI and being anti-racist. I would love to hear, like, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently in this work if you can go back in time?
So for me, I think about the role I played in steering students away from historically Black colleges and universities, what pretty much everyone calls HBCUs. And so this is an example of what people call algorithmic racism. I never once said HBCUs are bad, what I did is I created a set of tools that students and college counselors used to consider colleges that had high graduation rates and that had historically given lots of aid to Noble students. And because of systemic inequities, HBCUs tend to have fewer resources, and as a consequence, tended to pass fewer of those resources on to kids. And so because of all that background, my tools did not promote HBCUs to kids. And as a consequence of that, students didn't consider them at the rate they probably would have otherwise. And even if they did consider them, their counselors would have discouraged them from thinking about those schools as realistic options. And I am particularly embarrassed about this example because I should have known better. I was not at all ignorant about HBCUs. At the time, I had probably a dozen or so personal friends who had told me about the transformative experience they had personally attending HBCUs. In my prior work at KIPP, I worked very closely with the UNCF, which is probably the predominant organization in the country for supporting and promoting HBCUs. And so if there was a white guy out there who should have known about HBCUs and the benefit they could have for students, it should have been me. And I missed the opportunity to fix that policy. And that was me coming into Noble. In my first few months, I was also told about it and told about the need to change. And so at the time, we had one principal who was an HBCU alum, and she came and talked to a meeting of college counselors. And I think it's fair to say, scolded us for being racist. And so as everyone can imagine, many, if not pretty much all of the college counselors were, they were mad about it, and they were dismissive of the message, including the couple of Black college counselors we had at the time. And so again, because I was confident in what the data said, I chose to ignore that message. I chose to focus on the character of the message and not the content of it. And as a consequence, we continued with that policy for another 3 years. And so because I decided to police the tone of the Black woman who was giving me that really useful information, we had worse policy for Noble students for 3 more years. And so what helped with eventually changing the policy was more college counselors and more principals who cared about HBCUs and helped raise the issue again until finally I made efforts to change it. And so I'd say it shouldn't have taken that. And so I regret the fact that I was policing the tone, but I'd also raise this as an example of, one of the benefits of diverse teams and one of the reasons why I'm grateful that our Chiefs team is no longer pretty much all white and pretty much all male. And I think it's fair to say, I echo the sentiments of the kind of the white male Chiefs who've been around for a long time and sharing that gratitude. And it's not that we were actively trying to enact racist policies before, but rather it's harder to do so when you have more peers who share in the identity and the background of the students that you serve. And so the final point I want to make is, about what I just said, it's not the job of our colleagues of color to check us, right? White people at Noble, we need to do the work to be anti-racist ourselves. We need to continue to do that work. That said, it's great when you have colleagues who push you to be better. And it's one of the many reasons that I'm grateful of the current direction and the current future Noble has in front of us.
Thank you, Matt. Jonas?
Yeah, the irony of my work in Noble is that, when you look at the dean of culture, that room and that space, it's predominantly staff members of color, men and women of color. When we sat in that room, we didn't debate about, whether or not a policy was unjust or inequitable. That wasn't the topic of conversation. I've sent kids home or suspended students who had red hair or hair color that we considered unnatural at the time. Our Black young ladies in particular, my niece has red hair, there's an opportunity, there was an opportunity to stand up and say something. And so when I'm thinking about it right now, very naturally, I would address every kid from this lens of humanity and as an individual, and not for the purposes of being, consistent, because that didn't often serve kids well. When I think about one of our alum right now who decided not to go off to college, and I remember the debate being like, well, on college signing day, she has to hold up a banner of one of the colleges that she was accepted into, but she was very adamant that she wanted to go off into the military. And so she's done that right now, and she's doing very well, and she's a serial entrepreneur and doing some really amazing things. But she was also one of the first students at, Mushin that, we put up for expulsion. And we decided not to expel her. Literally at the table of the expulsion, her mom was crying, she was crying, and we made a decision to keep her. But she was the only one in my 7 years. Any other student that we put up for expulsion, they were expelled, with very little pushback. And so the opportunity right now to acknowledge that, right? Acknowledge that there were a lot of kids that we did well by, and they're succeeding right now, and they've graduated from college and started families and purchased homes, right? That's amazing. But there are definitely students that could absolutely raise their hand and say, what about me? And so knowing that is where, I have to consistently remind myself that every student is an individual and deserves the opportunity to be redeemed.
Yeah, thank you, Jonas. I know that we can spend countless hours engaging in this conversation, and there are so many more questions that need to be asked and answered. But I just want to say I appreciate all of your vulnerability today and naming and confronting our past. I want to name that because some of us don't even realize we have held problematic beliefs instilled in us through our upbringing. We bring bias to whatever policy is laid out for us in our day-to-day practice. Until we name and face those mindsets directly, there is a real and present danger that policy change can only impact our student experience on paper. It will be critical that we look at feedback through the lens of anti-racism and are especially aware of and actively fighting against those biases as we think about practice concretely. My hope is that all of Noble, all of us, that we begin and or continue the conversation of how and why we have upheld white supremacy and what we need to do personally and as an organization to dismantle racism. Matt, Kyle, Jonas, and Rachel, thank you so much today for your time and for your vulnerability. I appreciate this conversation, and I know so many more people do as well.